Picture this. A drawing room in the west wing of Harwick Hall, the finest estate in 3 counties, chandeliers burning at full height, 40 of the most consequential people in the district, arranged on silk chairs and settees with their tea growing cold in their hands. And in the center of it all, the Duke of Harwick standing beside the fireplace with the easy authority of a man who has never once been told that what he was about to do was unforgivable. At his side, not his wife. Leonora, Duchess of Harwick, stood near the window, alone, her hands folded in her lap with the particular stillness of a woman who has been practicing stillness for a very long time. She had been his wife for 9 years. She had run his household, managed his accounts, smoothed over his absences with the kind of gracious invention that no one ever thanks you for because it works too well to be noticed. And tonight, her husband cleared his throat in the way he always did before making an announcement he considered significant, and said the words that would travel from drawing room to drawing room across the county before the week was out. "Allow me to introduce Miss Dorinda Frey," he said. The woman beside him smiled. She was perhaps 24, dressed in a shade of amber that had been chosen with considerable deliberate care. She smiled the smiles of someone who had decided some weeks ago that she had already won. 40 people held 40 breaths. Leonora set down her teacup. She set it down very carefully, very quietly, on the table beside her chair. She rose. She crossed the room with the unhurried composure of a woman who has been crossing rooms exactly like this one since she was 17, and she stopped in front of Miss Dorinda Frey, and she looked at her for one long, even moment. Then she extended her hand. "How do you do?" she said. Her voice did not tremble. Miss Frey, who had prepared for tears and received a handshake, took it. Leonora turned. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at the 40 people who were watching her with the collective held breath of an audience, waiting to see whether a tightrope walker would fall. She walked to the door with the measured pace of a woman who has somewhere better to be, collected her shawl from the footman in the entrance hall, and stepped out into the September evening. The carriage was waiting. It always was. That was what she did. She knew where everything was. Behind her, inside Harwick Hall, 40 people exhaled, and then, because they were who they were, and this was how things worked, they began to talk. They would talk for weeks. They would talk about the Duke and his extraordinary lapse of judgment and the amber-dressed Miss Frey and what on earth he had been thinking. But what they would return to, what they would repeat at every breakfast table and morning call between here and the city, was Leonora, the handshake, they would say. She shook her hand. She smiled. And then she just left. Not one of them knew what she was going to do next. But a man named Mistress, her father's solicitor, was already in receipt of a letter she had sent 3 days ago. She had suspected. She had not said so, even to herself, because to name a thing is to make it real, and she had spent the better part of 2 years making very careful choices about what she was willing to make real. But she had suspected, and she had written the letter, and she had asked Mr. Birch a single question: "What belongs to me?" The house she went to was called Selwick Lodge. It sat at the edge of her family's original estate, 8 miles from Harwick Hall, on land that her grandmother had held separately and left. With the kind of deliberate legal specificity that suggests a woman who understood the world her granddaughter would inherit, directly to Leonora and no one else. Not to the Duke, not to the Harwick estate, to Leonora Margaret Ashby, as she had been, as she still was, underneath everything the last 9 years had added on top. She had not been there in 6 years. She arrived on a Friday morning with 1 trunk, her maid Patience, and a leather case that contained everything Mr. Birch had sent her over the 72 hours since she had written. He had sent quite a lot. The caretaker, a spare and sensible man named Hobson, who had managed the lodge in her absence without complaint or fanfare, opened the door before she had finished stepping down from the carriage. He looked at her. He looked at the trunk. He asked no questions. "The stove is going," he said. "There's bread from this morning." "Thank you, Mr. Hobson," Leonora said. "That will do very well." She went inside. The lodge smelled of wood smoke and old stone, and something underneath both of those things, something she identified after a moment as quiet. Actual quiet, the kind that had nothing to perform. She stood in the entry for a moment with her traveling coat still on. Then she went to the desk in the sitting room, opened the leather case, and began to read. The question she had asked Mr. Birch, "What belongs to me?" had produced an answer that was more extensive than she had feared, and less devastating than she had imagined in the sleepless hours of the week before. Selwick Lodge and its grounds, hers outright under her grandmother's will, a trust established by her father when she married, structured with the same deliberate specificity, generating income she had never touched, had barely thought of, because she had not needed to think of it. The Ashby jewels, hers by specific bequest, not the Harwick pieces, those she had already set aside on the dressing table at Harwick Hall. She read the figures Mr. Birch had compiled and read them again, and then she looked out the window at the garden, which had gone somewhat wild in her absence, but retained the bones of something that had once been tended with care. She was not wealthy, but she was, for the first time in 9 years, independent. The word sat in her chest, like the first breath after a long-held one. She picked up her pen. The first visitor arrived on the 3rd day. Lady Constance Moorfield came in a carriage that was thoroughly unsuited to the narrow lane approaching the lodge, got stuck briefly at the gate-posts, and emerged entirely composed in a shade of green that suited her very well. She was Leonora's oldest friend. They had come out the same season. They had written to each other without fail across the years and the distance that marriage had placed between them. She walked through the door, looked at Leonora at the desk, with papers arranged around her in careful order, and said, "Good God, Nora, you look like yourself." "Sit down, Constance," Leonora said. "Patience will bring tea. Tell me what they're saying." "That Dorinda Frey has no people to speak of," Lady Constance said, sitting. "That the Duke has lost whatever sense he possessed. That your exit from Harwick Hall on Thursday evening was the most composed thing anyone in this district has witnessed in living memory." She accepted her tea and looked at Leonora steadily, "and that no one can determine whether you are very brave or very destroyed." "How do I seem to you?" Leonora asked. Lady Constance studied her. The papers, the straight back, the absence of the particular hollow quality that grief carves into a face. "Occupied," she said finally. "You seem occupied." "I am," Leonora said extensively. She did not elaborate. Lady Constance, who was perceptive and had known Leonora for 20 years, did not press. But she came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that, and she was not the only one. They came, the women of the county, with varying degrees of pretext. Mrs. Daly arrived ostensibly to return a recipe she had borrowed and left it on the hall table without mentioning it. Young Mrs. Parfitt, recently married and already quietly unhappy in the way that some young women are quietly unhappy in large houses, with men who are not unkind but are simply not paying attention, arrived with no pretext at all and stood in the doorway and said, "I wasn't sure where else to go. There were..." Leonora brought her in and gave her tea and listened properly, the way she had spent 9 years learning to listen at Harwick Hall dinners, except that now she was listening because she chose to, and not because it was required of her, and the difference was considerable. When Mrs. Parfitt left, she looked lighter than when she had arrived. They all came, these women, from curiosity and from genuine feeling, and from something dimmer and harder to name, some instinct that something was happening at Selwick Lodge that was worth being near. Leonora received them all. She was warm and unhurried and present, and she did not stop working. Mr. Birch came himself on the second week, his old briefcase full of documents that he spread across the dining table, while Patience brought biscuits and pretended to be occupied elsewhere. He explained to Leonora, in his careful, methodical way, the precise condition of the Harwick estate finances. It was, he said, with the understatement of a man who had delivered difficult news for 40 years, not a straightforward picture. How complicated? Leonora asked. Mr. Birch looked at her over his spectacles. He had known her father. He had known Leonora since she was 12 years old and had arrived at his office with her grandmother to witness the signing of the trust documents and had asked at 12 a question about the reversionary clause that had genuinely surprised him. The Duke, he said, has been borrowing against the Harwick estate for approximately 4 years. The sums are not small. The repayment schedule has been, he paused, irregular. And Miss Frey. He paused again. Miss Frey's history prior to her arrival in this district included an association with a gentleman in Derbyshire who is no longer in possession of his estate. Leonora looked at the window. I see, she said. She picked up her pen. Mr. Birch, she said, I want to understand the complete picture, not the simplified version. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the briefcase and produced a second file, thicker than the first. I was rather expecting you to say that, he said. She encountered Mr. Thomas Rowe on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after she had arrived at the lodge. She had known of him in the vague way one knows of people who move in the same general world without ever occupying the same room. He had some connection to land management, she thought. A reputation for knowing what he was doing, which was rarer than it should have been. They had been at the same dinners twice, perhaps 3 times. And he had made no particular impression, which she now understood said more about those dinners than about him. He appeared at the edge of her garden at 4:30 with his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man who is aware that he has appeared somewhere without adequate preparation. Lady Harwick, he said, forgive me. My property runs along the northern boundary. I should have called properly weeks ago, but I didn't want to. He stopped. Intrude, Leonora suggested. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. Yes, that exactly. You're not intruding, Mr. Rowe. Would you like to see the garden? I've been trying to understand what's salvageable and what isn't, and I find I'm not qualified to judge. He was, it turned out, considerably qualified. He knew about garden drainage and old rose stock, and the particular way the soil in this part of the county behaved in September in the specific and detailed manner that Leonora was coming to understand was simply his nature. He knew things properly. He did not perform his knowing. He told her what was still good, and what needed cutting back, and what was simply too far gone, and then he stopped and let her think, which she found extraordinary. When he left, Leonora stood at the gate and watched him walk back along the northern boundary, and thought that she could not remember the last time a conversation had left her. Feeling more herself rather than less, she went inside. Mr. Birch's files waited on the desk. She sat down, she picked up her pen, and from Harwick Hall, 8 miles distant, a carriage was being readied. The Duke of Harwick arrived on a Saturday without sending word ahead. This, Leonora understood at once, was intentional. He had expected to find her undone. He had expected to find her waiting in the way she had always been there, constant and requiring no particular consideration. He found her instead in the kitchen garden consulting with Hobson about the herb beds. She saw his carriage at the end of the lane. She finished what she was saying to Hobson. She pulled her sleeves down, buttoned her cuffs, and walked to meet him. Leonora, he said. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has rearranged itself without asking his permission. You look, he stopped. Well, she suggested pleasantly, come in. Patience will bring tea. He sat in the small sitting room of the lodge with the expression of a man who has spent 9 years in a house with 26 rooms and cannot quite calibrate himself to a space that is simply a room. Leonora sat across from him and poured with steady hands. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Whatever point you feel you've made, Nora." "I am home," she said. He set down his cup. "Harwick Hall is your home. Selwick Lodge belonged to my grandmother," she said, "and now it belongs to me, so yes, I'm home." He was not entirely well. She could see it. The shadows beneath his eyes were new, and there was something unsteady in him that she had not seen before. The look of a man who has been sleeping badly and discovering, perhaps for the first time, that the structure he built his life on had less foundation than he assumed. "The county is talking," he said. "The county is always talking. About you," she said gently, "and about Miss Frey. I understand I've been cast rather sympathetically." His jaw tightened. "You made a scene." She looked at him for a long moment. "I shook her hand," she said, and left. "I'm genuinely curious to know at which point during either of those actions you feel a scene occurred." He had no answer. She had known he wouldn't. He left 40 minutes later without having achieved anything he came for. Leonora watched the carriage go from the sitting room window, and then she turned back to the desk. She had not told him what she knew. Not yet. The full picture, assembled across her dining table over 3 weeks, was considerably worse than Mr. Birch had indicated in his first careful summary. It was not only that the Duke had borrowed against the estate. It was from whom he had borrowed, and on what terms, and what had become of the money once it left his hands. Mr. Birch had been thorough about Miss Dorinda Frey. Her name had not always been Frey. She had been born Dorinda Marsh, in a town north of Bristol, the daughter of a minor tradesman with ambitions that outran his means. She was intelligent and striking, and possessed of a remarkable ability to become whatever a particular man most needed her to be. She had moved through 3 different social circles in 8 years, each slightly more elevated than the last, and she had left behind her in each one a man who could not afterward clearly explain how he had arrived at the end of what he owned. The gentleman in Derbyshire, Mr. Birch noted with delicate precision, was not a foolish man. He had been a man who wanted very badly to believe something that was not true. Leonora recognized this. She read the file on Dorinda Frey twice, slowly, and then she folded it and placed it in the leather case, and sat for a while, in the quiet of the sitting room, with the fire going, and the evening coming down over the hills. She had expected to feel something sharper than what arrived. Vindication, perhaps. Or rage, the clean, burning kind. What arrived instead was something closer to sorrow. For the 9 years, for the man her husband might have chosen to be. For all the dinners she had managed, and all the absences she had covered for, and all the small, careful, invisible work of her life at Harwick Hall, and what it had and had not been worth. She gave herself 20 minutes of this. Then she opened the case and went back to work. It began to come apart publicly in October. These things always did. The county ran on information the way an engine runs on fuel, and secrets had a structural fragility in a world built on knowing things about one another. They needed to be told. They needed to move. The first crack appeared at Mrs. Morefield's card evening, where Dorinda Frey arrived in a gown that was widely acknowledged to be extraordinary, and seated herself in a manner that suggested she had begun to understand her position as permanent. Lady Constance Morefield, who was not her mother but whose house it was, looked at Dorinda across the card table with the expression of a woman making a social observation. "Miss Frey," Lady Constance said, "I wonder if you could settle something for me. There was a gentleman in Derbyshire, a Mr. Callum Greaves. I've been trying to place where I heard the name." The table went quiet. Dorinda smiled. "I'm afraid I don't know a Mr. Greaves." "How strange," said Lady Constance, arranging her cards. "He seems to know you very well." It was a small thing. A question. A smile. Nothing provable. But the county was a machine that ran on exactly this kind of fuel, and by the following morning the question had spread and attached itself to other questions that had been quietly accumulating for weeks. Who is she exactly? And what happened in Derbyshire? The Duke heard the whispers. He heard them the way a man hears distant thunder, first at a manageable distance and then not. He went to Dorinda with what he had heard, and she was warm and reassuring and entirely plausible, and for approximately 4 days he believed her. Then the letter arrived from his primary creditor. It was brief. It informed him, in the clipped language of a man who has extended considerably more patience than his terms required, that the outstanding balance had reached a figure that necessitated immediate discussion, and that if such discussion was not forthcoming within 30 days, his legal representatives would be engaged. The Duke read it twice. He poured himself a drink. Then he went to Dorinda and told her, because there was no one else to tell, which was a condition he had not noticed, arriving until it was already complete. She listened. She was sympathetic. She took his hand and said, "There is a Lord Sandry who has been asking after an introduction. He's very well situated, if you were to arrange it." The Duke looked at her. Something shifted. Not a conclusion, not yet, but the beginning of one. Something he had been refusing to look at directly, which had the particular quality of a thing that has been waiting patiently to be seen. "You want me to introduce you," he said slowly, "to a wealthy lord." She smiled. "I want us to find a way through this together, darling." He thought about Leonora in the drawing room at Harwick Hall, extending her hand to this woman with perfect composure. He thought about Leonora in the lodge garden with her sleeves rolled up, looking at him from across the lane as though his arrival were a minor inconvenience she had already accounted for. He thought about the way she had looked at him across the tea table and asked with genuine curiosity, rather than accusation. At what point, during either of those actions, he felt a scene had occurred. He had several more drinks, and the next morning he wrote to Selwick Lodge. It was not an apology. He was not yet capable of an apology. He was moving toward it the way a man moves toward something he does not quite want to reach, because reaching it means fully acknowledging what he has done. The letter said, "Leonora, I think we should speak properly. Not as we did last time." She read it at the desk. She set it down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote back, "Then come properly and send word ahead. Mr. Hobson makes good coffee." He came on a Tuesday. Before he arrived, Leonora put away the papers on her desk, not because she was concealing them. She knew everything they contained. She no longer needed to look at them to hold them. Thomas Rowe, walking his northern boundary that same morning, saw the carriage come up the lane and stood at the fence for a moment. He did not come to the lodge. It was not his place, but he stayed at the fence a little longer than necessary before walking on. The valley was still. The garden, the parts worth keeping, waited in the October light. Inside, Leonora put the kettle on. He looked different. This was the first thing she noticed when the Duke stepped through the door of Selwick Lodge. Not different in the way that time makes a man different, gradually and without drama, but different in the way that consequences do. Something had gone out of him. That quality of a man who has never seriously considered that things might not arrange themselves around his comfort. It was still present, but diminished. Like a fire banked low. She noted it. She did not remark on it. "Come in," she said. "Mr. Hobson's coffee is on the stove." He sat at the small table in the kitchen and looked around the lodge with the expression of a man trying to understand something that resisted all his usual tools for understanding. "You're comfortable here," he said. "Very," she said. "I didn't think you would be. I know you didn't." They sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the autumn was doing what autumn does in the hills, steady and indifferent and beautiful. The lodge was warm in the way Harwick Hall, with all its proportions, had never quite managed, not impressive. just genuinely itself. He set down his cup. "I have made mistakes," he said. "With the estate, with certain decisions." He did not say her name, Dorinda's name. Leonora noticed this. Things are more complicated than they should be. "Yes," Leonora said. "I know." He looked up sharply. "What do you know?" "Enough," she said. "Mr. Birch is thorough, as you may recall." The color in his face moved through several arrangements at once. Shame and defensiveness arriving simultaneously and competing for precedence. Shame won, narrowly. "You've been investigating." "I've been understanding my own situation," she said, "which required understanding yours. I should have done it years ago. That is as much on me as anyone." He was quiet. Outside the hills. "I want you to come home," he said. Leonora had known it was coming. She had known it since his letter arrived. Had known it, if she was honest, before that, from the moment she stepped out of Harwick Hall and understood that her husband had not, in 9 years, seriously considered what her absence would mean. She had been there. She was simply there. The way a man assumes the roof is there, without gratitude, without attention, until the first rain comes through. She was not angry about this anymore. She had been briefly, and with considerable intensity, in the small hours of the first week at the lodge, but anger was expensive to maintain and produced little of lasting value. She had spent it and moved forward. "Why?" she asked. He blinked. "I'd like to understand what you mean by it," she said. 9 years of being your wife have not, on reflection, been a sufficient argument on their own. What would be different? Silence. He opened his mouth, closed it. He had prepared, she could see it, for refusal, or for tears, or for the full range of responses a wronged wife might produce. He had not prepared for a woman who simply wanted to understand his reasoning. "Because you're my wife," he said. "I am," she agreed. "And I have been for 9 years, while your attention was elsewhere. So the fact of it alone doesn't seem to settle the question. What would be different?" He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at something that was not visible in the room. "I don't know," he said at last. And for the first time, something she had not heard in 9 years arrived in his voice. Something unguarded, something that had not been shaped for any particular effect. "That is the most honest thing you have ever said to me," she told him quietly. When he made his proposal, it was practical in character. This was, she thought, at least consistent. What he offered was stripped of performance, because he no longer had enough left with which to perform. "Come back, resume your place." The county would accept it. The creditors could be managed if the estate presented a stable face. He would be, he searched for the word, present. He would be present. Leonora listened to all of it without interrupting. She gave him the courtesy of being fully heard, which was not a small thing, and they both knew it. Then she was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "not with heat, not with triumph. Simply no." He stared at her. "I'm not coming back to Harwick Hall," she said. "Not on those terms, not on any terms that would look like the last 9 years. I won't do that. And not because I wish to punish you. Punishment is exhausting, and I have better uses for my time, but because going back to what we had would be dishonest, and I find I have used up every last reserve of dishonesty I possess. Then what do you want?" He said it with the raw sound of a man who has exhausted his moves. "I don't want anything from you," she said, and the plainness of it stopped him entirely. "That's the point. I have what I need. I have this house and my grandmother's land and my own mind, which it turns out functions considerably better when given room to operate freely. I don't need you to give me anything. I need you to understand that." He sat across from her, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked genuinely without a next move. "What happens to us?" he said. "I don't know yet," Leonora said, "but whatever it is, it will be true." That is more than we have had in quite some time." He was in the lane waiting for the carriage when Thomas Rowe appeared at the northern gate. Whether this was entirely accidental would have been difficult to determine. Thomas had the quality of being precisely where he was, without apology or announcement, as though his presence required neither justification nor excuse. He had been checking the fence, which was a legitimate activity. The two men looked at each other across the lane. They had known each other for years. Different circles, adjacent territory, the occasional shared dinner table. They were not enemies. They were not friends. They were two men who had taken each other's measure across various rooms and found the measurement in each case instructive. "Row," the Duke said. "Your Grace," Thomas said. His voice was entirely level, not cold, not warm, precisely calibrated. A pause. The carriage was not yet visible. "You're the neighbor," the Duke said. "Along the northern boundary," Thomas said. "Your wife's garden is coming back well. Good bones, that soil." The Duke looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the lodge, where Leonora had returned to the sitting-room window. Not watching exactly. Present, the way she was always present, aware of everything, attending to what mattered. And the Duke of Harwick, who had been educated and titled and charming and thoroughly accustomed to being the most significant person in any room he entered, felt for the first time in his adult life the specific weight of what carelessness costs. Not the marriage, not even the wife precisely. The person, the specific, irreplaceable, particular person who had been standing in front of him for 9 years, while he looked past her at things that were considerably smaller and less worth his attention. The carriage came. He got in. Thomas watched it go. Then he walked to the lodge and knocked. Leonora opened the door. "I saw," she said. "Come in. Patience has made shortbread." He came in. They sat in the sitting room with the fire and the shortbread and the quiet that had developed between them over the past weeks, a quiet that was not empty but inhabited, full of things that did not require saying. "He's going to contest this," Thomas said eventually. Not a prediction, an observation offered without alarm. "I know," Leonora said. "Are you all right?" She considered the question properly. Not the automatic yes, quite fine of 9 years of performed composure, but the real answer, found by actually looking. "Yes," she said. "I rather think I am." He looked at her in the firelight with the shortbread between them and the leather case on the desk, and the garden waiting outside in the last of the October light. He looked at her the way almost no one had looked at her in a very long time. Not at the Duchess, not at the function she performed. At her. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I knew your husband some years ago," he said, "before you married. Not well, but enough. I was at a dinner the winter you came out." He paused. "I noticed you before he did." Leonora was quiet. "I thought you were the most genuinely curious person I had encountered in years," Thomas said. "At a dinner that had 40 people competing for the distinction of being interesting. You were asking the hostess about her kitchen garden. You wanted to know which variety of apple kept best through winter." He was quiet for a moment, and then he saw you and I stepped back, because I believed at the time that he was the sort of man who deserved that. "And now?" she said. He met her eyes directly. "I was mistaken about that." She looked at the fire. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've been your neighbor for 4 weeks," he said, "and your friend for 3, and I find I am running out of patience with failing to be honest when honesty is what the situation requires." He paused. "I'm not asking you to do anything with it. I only wanted you to know that someone noticed you before any of this. Someone was paying attention." The fire crackled. Outside the valley was going dark, the hills pulling the last light behind them. Leonora felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories where the shift announces itself, more like a door that has been closed for a long time, opening by degrees, letting in air that is cooler and cleaner than the room had been. "Mr. Rowe," she said. "Yes. Ask me properly to dinner. Next week." He looked at her. That preparation for a smile she had noticed before arrived at last into the full thing. It suited him, she thought. "Lady Harwick," he said, "Would you do me the honor of dining with me next Friday evening?" "I would," she said. "Thank you for asking properly. It matters more than people seem to understand." And on the road back to the city, the Duke's carriage moved through the October dark, carrying a man who had just begun to understand, in the complete and uncomforting way, the full cost of what he had treated as ordinary. Dorinda Frey made her final error on a Thursday. She had always operated on instinct, quick, sharp, effective instinct that had served her across 3 counties and 2 failed estates, and considerably more ground covered than most people would have managed. The difficulty with instinct, as distinct from judgment, is that it does not slow when slowing is precisely what is required. It simply continues. She had set her attention on a Mistress Halford Greening, recently widowed, recently arrived in the city, in possession of a fortune sufficiently substantial to produce a certain lightheadedness in those who thought about it directly. She found him at a gathering in the 2nd week of October, and was, by her own assessment, magnificent. He was laughing within the hour. He was suggesting a second meeting within 2, what Dorinda did not know, because she had not been attending to the county's social currents with her usual precision, occupied as she was with the deteriorating situation at Harwick Hall, was that Mr. Greening was Lady Constance Morfield's cousin, and Lady Constance had been paying very close attention for 6 weeks. Lady Constance was not a woman given to dramatic interventions. She was, however, a woman who knew exactly what she knew and understood precisely what to do with it. She had written to acquaintances in Bristol. She had made inquiries through her husband's solicitor. She had spoken with Mr. Birch, not about Leonora's affairs, which were not her business, but about certain other matters which were. She was ready. When Mr. Greening mentioned Dorinda Frey to his cousin over breakfast. On a Friday morning, Lady Constance listened. She poured more tea. She set the pot down with great deliberateness. Then she told him, without sensationalism or embellishment, precisely what she had established about Miss Dorinda Frey, formerly of Bristol, formerly of several other places that had found her presence ultimately inconvenient, with the documentary evidence arranged between them on the breakfast table. Mr. Greening read every page. He did not attend the next gathering at which Dorinda expected to see him. He sent no explanation. He simply was not there. Dorinda noticed his absence. She made inquiries that produced no satisfactory answer. For the first time in some years, she felt something unfamiliar. She felt the ground shift. It happened publicly on a Wednesday, as these things tend to. A small gathering, at the home of a family centrally enough positioned that what occurred in their drawing room would be thoroughly disseminated by morning. Dorinda arrived with the confidence of a woman who had been building her position for months. She did not notice that the room's temperature had changed until she was already several steps inside it. It was nothing as legible as exclusion. The county was far too accomplished for that. The county was the slight hesitation before a greeting. The way a conversation concluded naturally, just as she arrived, the specific quality of a smile that offers nothing behind it. Lady Constance was in the room. Dorinda had known she would be. She had told herself that the card table question about Mr. Greaves had been managed, had left no lasting impression. She heard, clearly and without ambiguity, Lady Constance say to the woman beside her, in the carrying tone of someone who is entirely aware of the room's acoustics, the word Bristol, and then, after a brief pause, the name Price. "Such a curious coincidence," Lady Constance said pleasantly. "Wouldn't you say?" Dorinda understood in that moment, with the instinctive clarity that had always been her sharpest tool, that the game in this particular county was finished. The question was only how she left it. She chose well. She did not make a scene. She claimed a headache with composure, thanked her hostess, and left. In the carriage alone, she sat in the dark for some time. Then she made the calculations that women in her position have always made when one set of circumstances closes and another must be found. She went to the Duke on Thursday morning. He was in his study at Harwick Hall with a letter from his solicitor open in front of him when she was announced. He looked up. Something crossed his face that had the memory of warmth in it, and beneath that, something more recent and considerably more complicated. She sat across from him. She was as well turned out as ever. She did not waste what she had. "I'm going to Edinburgh," she said. He stared. "I have people there," she said. "Opportunities better suited to my present circumstances." She paused. Something moved across her face that might, in a different version of her life, have been something like regret. "I think we both know this has run its course." "You're leaving," he said. "I'm being sensible," she said. "Which is rather more than you have been, if we're honest." She rose, and could not quite prevent herself from adding, "You should have been more careful with the money. I can't build something from nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Leonora across the small table at the lodge, asking him in that clear level voice what would be different, treating his answers as though they were worth examining, giving him the courtesy of being fully heard. He thought about the quality of that attention, how it compared. "Goodbye, Miss Frey," he said. She left, and the Duke of Harwick sat alone in the study and he always considered his, in the house that was increasingly revealing itself to be considerably less his than he had assumed, and looked without any remaining obstruction at the last 4 years. He sat for a long time. Then he picked up a piece of paper and began to write. The letter arrived at Selwick Lodge on a Saturday. Leonora was at the desk, as she most often was now, though the work had changed character. Less defensive, more deliberate. The difference between shoring up a wall and laying a foundation. She recognized his handwriting. She opened it. It was 3 pages. His hand, usually controlled and even, ran slightly uneven in places, the way a hand runs when it has been pressing hard. He did not make excuses. This surprised her enough that she stopped and read the relevant passage twice to confirm it. He did not contextualize or justify or explain what had led to what. He described what he had done, what he had known and chosen not to examine, what he had taken without accounting for the taking, and he did it with a specificity that suggested he had been making himself look at it fully before committing it to paper. He said he was sorry. He said he understood that this was not sufficient. He said he was saying it anyway, because she deserved to hear it even if it changed nothing and could not be used for anything. "And then this I think I have understood, for longer than I knew what to do with, that you were the better part of everything I was supposed to be. I did not know what that understanding required of me. I know now that it required everything I withheld. I am sorry I arrived at that knowledge this late and at this cost." Leonora set the letter down. She sat for a while. She did not cry. She had believed she might, when this moment arrived, had quietly prepared for it. But what came was not tears. It was something quieter, something like the last movement of a door that has been closing by degrees, settling now into its frame with a sound that was final and gentle and complete. She folded the letter. She did not put it in a drawer. She placed it on the corner of the desk, where she could see it, because it was evidence of something she believed in. That people could be honest when it cost them something, that it counted even when it arrived too late to change what had already been lost. She did not write back that day. The document from Mr. Birch arrived on a Monday. 2 sentences of cover letter and then the formal separation agreement. Separate maintenance, separate residence, full independent control of her finances and property. It was not a divorce, which remained legally prohibitive, but it accomplished in practical terms nearly everything that mattered. She sat with it on the desk for a long time. Outside, she could hear Thomas in the garden. He had come that morning to look at the drainage along the northern side, which had been causing problems, and had stayed, as he often stayed, moving quietly through the grounds, being useful, asking for nothing in return. She went to the window, she called. He appeared from behind the far hedge, looking up unhurried. "Come inside," she said. "I need to think out loud. Mr. Hobson has made apple cake." He came inside. She did not sign the document that day. She thought instead, carefully and without rushing, because she had learned in the past weeks that decisions of this weight deserved to be made in full possession of herself, with complete understanding of what she was choosing. She was ready by Thursday. She sat at the desk in the morning, read every page of the agreement with the attention it warranted, and picked up her pen and signed. Leonora Margaret Ashby, as she had been and still was, underneath everything else. She sealed it and sent it to Mr. Birch with a brief note. Then she put on her coat and went out to the garden. It was a cold morning, clean and bright, the kind that makes the hills look newly made. She walked the paths slowly, learning them again, remembering what her grandmother had grown here and what she was beginning to grow herself. She stood in the middle of the garden for a while, doing nothing except being present in it. Then she went inside and got back to work. She did not hear from the Duke directly after Mr. Birch sent the signed agreement. What reached her, through Lady Constance, who remained her most reliable correspondent in all things, was that he had received it without contest, had signed his own portion quietly, and had then done something that surprised the people who knew him. He had dismissed his London solicitors. He had engaged a new firm. He had reduced the Harwick household, sold the secondary property in the north, and appeared at his desk, Lady Constance reported with barely concealed disbelief, before 9 in the morning on several consecutive occasions. Working, genuinely. "He looks terrible," Lady Constance said when she came to the lodge in November, meaning it kindly. "He looks like a man who has stopped pretending, which is always alarming to witness, but generally a good sign for what comes after." "He'll be all right," Leonora said. She meant it as assessment, not absolution. Richard had not been a cruel man. He had been a man so accustomed to the world accommodating itself to his preferences that he had never built the capacity to accommodate himself to anyone else's. Those capacities could be built if the will arrived. Whether the will would hold was no longer her concern. She found this was a thing she could mean completely. "And you," Lady Constance said, in the particular tone she used for the question beneath the question. Leonora thought about it properly. "I have the lodge," she said, "and the garden, which is coming back better than I expected. I have Mr. Birch, who is the most practically useful person I have ever known. I have Patience and Mr. Hobson, who between them manage everything I have not yet learned to manage myself. I have you." She paused. "And I have Thomas Rowe, who knows the difference between the plants worth keeping and the ones too far gone, and who tells me the truth even when he has not been asked." Lady Constance looked at her for a moment. The look of a woman watching something arrive that she had hoped for. "You're happy," she said. Leonora considered this. "I'm myself," she said. "It turns out that and happy are not the same thing, and that the second one follows considerably more reliably from the first." Thomas asked her to marry him on a morning in October, 12 months after she had first walked into Selwick Lodge with her single trunk and her leather case. He asked her in the garden, standing on the path she now knew by heart, in the plain, direct way that was simply how he was, all the way through. He told her he loved her. He told her in the specific language of someone who had been paying attention. To the way she asked questions and listened for the answers, to the precision of her thinking, to the fact that she had once spent 3/4 of an hour in genuinely heated discussion with Mr. Birch about a property boundary clause and had been, in Thomas's quietly held assessment, entirely correct. "I know your situation is complicated," he said. "I know your independence was hard won, and I would not ask you to compromise it." I'm asking if you would like a partner, not someone in front of you, not someone behind you, someone beside you who is on your side, with full understanding of what that means." She stood on the garden path and looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 19 and the aisle at St. Margaret's, and the belief, genuine and complete, that she was the most fortunate woman in the county. She thought about what it meant to be fortunate, whether it was the circumstances you were handed or whether it was something else, something more internal, a quality of attention and honesty and willingness to keep going when going required effort. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They married in December, quietly, with only the people who actually mattered, which turned out to be considerably fewer than she had spent 9 years trying to impress, and considerably more than she had feared in the worst of those nights at Harwick Hall, when the silence had felt like a verdict on her worth. Lady Constance wept through the ceremony and denied it afterward. Mr. Birch attended with the expression of a man whose work has been completed to his satisfaction. Mr. Hobson and Patience between them produced a wedding breakfast of such quality that it was discussed in the village for the remainder of the winter. On a Tuesday morning in late autumn, 2 years, and some weeks after she had walked out of Harwick Hall with her hand extended and her composure entirely intact, Leonora Rowe, who had been the Duchess of Harwick, and before that Leonora Ashby, and before that simply herself, sat at the desk in the lodge study and looked out at the garden. The beds were bare, patient, waiting. Thomas was somewhere on the property, doing something useful, which was simply always true of him. She could hear him at the far edge of the grounds, a footstep, a brief exchange with Hobson, and the sound of it was steady and ordinary and entirely unlike anything she had previously understood home to feel like. On her desk was a letter from Mr. Birch about an opportunity he thought warranted her attention, and 3 letters from women she had come to know over the past 2 years, women who had found their way to the lodge in various states of difficulty and had left it, all of them, in some better condition than they arrived. She had begun, without planning to make herself available in this way, as a thinking companion, a practical resource, someone who knew a thorough solicitor and was not afraid of difficult questions. She had not given it a name yet. She thought she might not need to. She thought, looking out at the garden in the autumn light, about what she would say if someone asked her how she had come from there to here. She thought she would say this: "I did not leave to punish him. I left because I had spent 9 years building a life around someone else's comfort, and had nearly forgotten that I was permitted to have one of my own. I left to find out who I was when no one was watching, when no one required anything of me, when the performance was finally over. It took time, it took work, it took a garden that had been let go and was better for the attention, and a solicitor who asked no unnecessary questions, and a man who walked along the northern boundary one afternoon with his hat in his hand and told me the truth because it was time. But I found her, and it turned out she was more than sufficient." She picked up her pen. Outside the garden waited, and the hills were clear against a pale autumn sky, and the morning was exactly itself, ordinary and particular and entirely enough.